Like and subscribe my video now. Thank you very much. The midnight knock. David had just moved to a small apartment on the outskirts of a quiet town. Like and subscribe my video now. The rent was cheap. Very much. The area was peaceful, and he needed a fresh start after his recent divorce. It seemed like the perfect place to rebuild his life. The apartment complex was old, built in the 1970s, with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways. Despite its age, it had a charm that David found comforting. His first few nights there were uneventful, marked only by the occasional hum of passing cars or the faint sound of his neighbor's television. But everything changed on his fourth night. At exactly 3 a.m., David was jolted awake by a sharp, rhythmic knocking at his door. Knock, knock, knock. Asterisk, asterisk, the sound was loud enough to echo through the apartment. His heart raced as he sat up in bed, disoriented and uneasy. He grabbed his phone and checked the time. 3:01 a.m. He lived alone. No one should have been at his door at this hour. Pulling on a hoodie, David cautiously approached the door. He peeked through the peephole, but saw nothing. The dim hallway outside was empty, illuminated only by the flickering light of a malfunctioning bulb. The knocking stopped. David's first thought was that it might have been a prank. Perhaps a teenager messing around, or a neighbor's drunk friend knocking on the wrong door. He opened the door and looked outside. The hallway stretched out in both directions, silent and empty. There was no one there. Just as he was about to close the door, he noticed something on the ground, a folded piece of paper. He picked it up, feeling a strange chill run down his spine. Written in jagged, uneven handwriting were 3 words. Confused and slightly unnerved, David stepped back inside and locked the door. He unfolded the note again, inspecting it more closely. The paper was old and yellowed, as if it had been torn from a decades-old notebook. The ink was smudged in places, but the message was clear. As he sat on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened, David's curiosity got the better of him. The warning seemed ridiculous. Why shouldn't he look outside? He got up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peek out. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing across the street, under the pale glow of a street lamp, was a figure. It was tall and motionless, shrouded in a black cloak. Its face was obscured, hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. Despite the figure's stillness, David felt its eyes on him, sharp and invasive. The air seemed to grow heavier, suffocating him with an overwhelming sense of dread. He quickly let the curtain fall and stepped back, his hands trembling. His mind raced with questions. Who was that? Why were they just standing there? And why had they left that note? David tried to shake off his fear, convincing himself it was a coincidence. Maybe it was someone waiting for a ride, or a harmless stranger passing through. He decided to go back to bed, but sleep was elusive. The image of the figure lingered in his mind, and every small sound in the apartment made him jump. The next night, David's anxiety was palpable. He double-checked the locks on his door and windows, drew the curtains tightly shut, and left a lamp on in the living room. He tried distracting himself with a book, but his mind kept drifting back to the night before. At exactly 3 a.m., the knocking returned. David froze. His body tensed, his breath caught in his throat. He stayed perfectly still, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But the knocking persisted, louder and more insistent. Knock, knock, knock. Asterisk, asterisk. Summoning his courage, David grabbed a kitchen knife and approached the door. He checked the peephole again, his heart pounding in his chest. Just like the previous night, the hallway was empty. But this time, the note wasn't on the ground. Instead, it was taped to the door at eye level. His hand shook as he tore it off and read the message. A wave of terror crashed over him. How did they know? Who were they? He dropped the note and bolted the door, backing away as his mind spiraled with fear. Suddenly, he heard a faint whisper coming from outside the window. It was barely audible, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but unmistakably human. Against his better judgment, David moved toward the window, his heart hammering in his chest. He hesitated for a moment before pulling the curtain aside ever so slightly. The figure was closer now, standing on the sidewalk just a few feet from his apartment building. Its hood was still drawn, concealing its face, but its posture was different, leaning forward, almost as if beckoning him. David stumbled back, letting the curtain fall shut. He couldn't stay here. He needed to leave. Grabbing his keys and phone, he hurried to the door, but the moment he unlocked it, the knocking resumed, this time from inside the apartment. His blood ran cold. The sound was coming from the other side of the living room, where a door led to a small storage closet. Knock, 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 asterisk, asterisk. Who's there? David stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a voice spoke, low and guttural. David's scream echoed through the empty apartment. The next morning, the landlord found David's apartment door wide open. Inside, the place was in disarray, as if a struggle had taken place. But David was nowhere to be found. The only clue left behind was a single piece of paper lying on the floor near the window. On it, written in the same jagged handwriting, were 3 words. To this day, no one knows what happened to David. Some say he fled the town, unable to cope with the fear. Others believe the figure took him, dragging him into the darkness from which it came. The apartment has since been rented out to other tenants, but many of them report strange occurrences. Flickering lights, mysterious whispers, and most chillingly, a rhythmic knocking at 3 a.m. If you ever hear a knock in the dead of night, remember David's story. And whatever you do, don't look outside. Like and subscribe my video now. Thank you very much. The Talking Doll. Lila had always loved antiques. She enjoyed the thrill of finding old treasures at estate sales and thrift stores, imagining the stories they carried with them. Her latest find, however, would become a story she wished she could forget. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when Lila stumbled upon a sprawling yard sale in a quiet suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. Among the usual odds and ends, her eyes landed on a doll. It was old, with porcelain skin, deep blue glass eyes, and golden curls that framed its delicate face. The doll was dressed in a faded lace gown that hinted at its age. How much for this? Lila asked the elderly woman running the sale. The woman's expression darkened. Oh, that old thing? Just take it. It's been sitting in my attic for years. Lila hesitated, but eventually smiled. Thank you. I'll give it a good home. Little did she know, she was about to give it much more than that. Back at her apartment, Lila placed the doll on a shelf in her living room. It fit perfectly among her collection of vintage knickknacks. That night, she felt an odd sense of unease, as though she were being watched. Shaking off the feeling, she went to bed. Around 3 a.m., a faint voice woke her. "Let's play," it whispered. Lila bolted upright, her heart pounding. She scanned the room, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Everything was still. The doll sat motionless on the shelf, its glassy eyes staring into the void. Convincing herself it was a dream, Lila laid back down, though sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, she inspected the doll more closely. It was heavier than she remembered, and as she turned it over, she noticed a small, hidden compartment on its back. Opening it revealed a wind-up key. Curiosity piqued, she turned the key and waited. At first, nothing happened. Then, the doll's lips moved, and in a sweet but unnerving voice, it said, "Let's play a game." Lila laughed nervously, chalking it up to old technology. "Well, you're creepier than I thought," she muttered, placing it back on the shelf. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. "You can't hide," the voice said. Lila's blood ran cold. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. Scanning the room, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, except the doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting on the coffee table, its head tilted slightly to one side, as if watching her. "Nope," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed the doll, shoved it into a box, and locked it in her closet. "You're staying there until I figure out what to do with you." But the whispers didn't stop. Over the next few days, Lila's life became a waking nightmare. Objects in her apartment moved on their own. Doors creaked open and shut. Lights flickered. And every night, at exactly 3 a.m., the doll's voice echoed through the apartment. "Let's play," it would say, followed by a sinister giggle. One evening, Lila decided she'd had enough. She took the doll out of the box and drove to the nearest pawn shop. The owner, a grizzled man with a cigarette hanging from his lips, took one look at the doll and shook his head. "Not interested," he said, his tone firm. "Why not? It's an antique," Lila protested. The man leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't want to mess with something like that. Get rid of it. Burn it if you have to." Chilled by his words, Lila left the shop, the doll still in her possession. She drove to a secluded area outside the city and dug a shallow grave, burying the doll along with her mounting fear. That night, Lila slept peacefully for the first time in days. But her relief was short-lived. The following morning, she woke to find the doll sitting on her kitchen counter, dirt still clinging to its lace gown. Panicked, she called her friend Sarah, who had always been skeptical of anything supernatural. "You got to help me," Lila pleaded. "This doll, it's alive." Sarah laughed. "Lila, you're letting your imagination get the best of you. I'll come over and prove it's just a doll." That evening, Sarah arrived armed with sage and a firm belief in rational explanations. Together, they performed a cleansing ritual, waving the burning sage around the apartment while Sarah chanted something she'd found on the internet. When they were done, Sarah turned to Lila and grinned. "See? Nothing to worry about." But as they sat down to relax, the doll's voice echoed from the shelf where Lila had placed it. "You can't get rid of me," it said. Both women froze. Sarah's face turned pale as the doll's head slowly turned to face them. Its lips moved again. "Let's play hide and seek." The power in the apartment went out, plunging them into darkness. Lila grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight. Sarah, now just as terrified, whispered, "What do we do?" We leave," Lila stammered. But when they reached the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as though an invisible force held it shut. The doll's voice came again, this time from the shadows. "It's your turn to hide." Panic set in as objects began flying off the shelves. The doll's laughter filled the room, high-pitched and menacing. Lila and Sarah ran to the bathroom, slamming the door behind them. They could hear the doll's tiny footsteps outside, pacing back and forth. "We have to destroy it," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "How?" Lila asked. "Fire. It's the only way." Summoning their courage, the two women burst out of the bathroom, armed with a can of hairspray and a lighter. The doll was in the living room, sitting in the center of the floor, as if waiting for them. Its head tilted, and it whispered, "You'll never win." "Watch us," Sarah snapped, igniting the makeshift flamethrower. The flames engulfed the doll, its porcelain skin cracking and blackening. Its screams were inhuman, a mix of childlike wails and guttural growls. The lights flickered violently, and the air grew heavy with the smell of burning plastic and fabric. When the fire died out, the doll was nothing more than ash and charred fragments. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the apartment fell silent. Lila and Sarah sat on the couch, shaken but relieved. They spent the rest of the night cleaning up and reassuring each other that the nightmare was over. By morning, the sun streamed through the windows, and everything felt normal again. But as Lila went to take out the trash, she froze. Sitting on the counter, untouched and pristine, was the doll. Its blue glass eyes seemed to glint with malice as it whispered one last time. "Let's play again." Room 13. Jack Miller was no stranger to long road trips. As a freelance photographer, he often found himself traveling across the United States, chasing the perfect shot. After a grueling day of capturing sunsets and abandoned barns in rural Nebraska, he decided to stop for the night at a small roadside motel. The sign read, "Hilltop Inn, clean rooms, low rates." Exhausted, Jack pulled into the empty parking lot. The motel was old, but well kept. A dim light flickered above the reception door, and the faint hum of crickets filled the night air. Inside, an elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses sat behind the counter. He looked up from his crossword puzzle as Jack entered. "Evening," the man greeted. "Looking for a room?" "Yeah," Jack replied, setting his camera bag on the counter. "Just for the night." The man slid a ledger across the counter. Jack signed his name, while the man retrieved a key from the wall behind him. It was old-fashioned, attached to a brass tag engraved with the number 12. Room 12. Into the hall on the right, the man said. He paused, glancing at Jack. Don't go wandering too far, okay? Jack raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Got it. Room 12 was small but clean, with a single bed, a nightstand, and a tiny bathroom. Jack tossed his bag onto the bed and collapsed onto the mattress, too tired to even change out his clothes. As he drifted off, he couldn't shake the odd tone in the clerk's voice. At some point during the night, a faint sound woke him. Thud, thud, thud. Asterisk, asterisk, it was rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door. Groggy, Jack sat up and listened. The sound was coming from the wall behind his bed. Probably just the pipes, he muttered, lying back down. But then it came again. Thud, thud, thud. Asterisk, asterisk. Jack's curiosity got the better of him. He climbed out of bed and pressed his ear to the wall. The sound was clearer now, more deliberate. It wasn't pipes. It was knocking. He checked his phone. 3:13 a.m. Deciding he needed to investigate, Jack grabbed his phone's flashlight and stepped into the hallway. The motel was eerily silent, the only light coming from a single flickering bulb at the far end. He followed the sound, which seemed to be coming from room 13. The door to room 13 was unlike the others. Its paint was peeling, and the number 13 was scratched into the wood as if by a knife. Jack hesitated. He hadn't noticed this room earlier. He knocked lightly. Hello? Anyone there? No response. The knocking had stopped. Jack's hand hovered over the doorknob. Screw it, he whispered, twisting the knob. It was unlocked. Inside, the room was dark and cold, a stark contrast to the rest of the motel. Jack swept his flashlight across the space. The furnishings were similar to his own room, but everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. The air smelled damp, and the wallpaper was peeling in long strips. In the center of the room was a bed. On it lay a single photograph. Jack approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The photo showed a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 young children, standing in front of a house. Their expressions were grim, and their eyes seemed wrong. Hollow. Beneath the photo was a note scrawled in jagged handwriting. Leave now. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. As he turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. His flashlight flickered and went out. No, 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 Jack muttered, fumbling with his phone. The air grew heavy, and a low whisper filled the room. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The flashlight came back on, and Jack saw them. Shadows, crawling along the walls and ceiling, their movements unnatural and jerky. A figure emerged from the corner, its form indistinct but terrifying. Its eyes glowed faintly, fixing on Jack. Get out, it hissed. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, yanking it open and sprinting down the hall. He didn't stop until he was back in room 12, slamming and locking the door behind him. His breath came in gasps as he sat on the bed, trying to process what he'd just seen. He needed to leave. Now! Grabbing his bag, Jack hurried out of the room, leaving the key on the nightstand. The clerk's desk was empty as he passed by, the crossword puzzle still lying open. As Jack reached his car and started the engine, he glanced back at the motel. Room 13's window was dark, but he could swear he saw a shadow move behind the curtains. The next day, Jack called a friend to share his experience. His friend, skeptical but intrigued, decided to do some research. A few hours later, Jack received a call. You're not going to believe this, his friend said. That motel? It's been abandoned for years. Burned down in the 80s after a family was murdered there. Room 13 was where they found the bodies. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. That can't be right. I stayed there last night. His friend's voice was quiet. Jack, are you sure? Because there's nothing there now. Just ashes. Jack hung up, his mind reeling. He pulled over on the side of the road and stared at his camera bag. Slowly, he unzipped it and pulled out his camera. As he scrolled through the photos, his heart stopped. Among the pictures of barns and sunsets was a new photo. The family from the photograph in room 13, staring directly at the camera. their hollow eyes boring into his soul. And beneath it, a message had been etched into the screen. See you soon. The Whispers in Black Hollow Forest. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway. Emily, David, and their two close friends, Rachel and Mark, had planned a camping trip to escape the noise of Los Angeles. David had found a secluded spot in the Black Hollow Forest, a place he'd heard about from a colleague. The forest was reputed for its beauty: towering pines, clear streams, and a sky full of stars. But it also carried an ominous nickname among locals: the Forest of Whispers. The group arrived on a sunny Friday afternoon, their spirits high. They parked their SUV at the trailhead, loaded their gear, and began the 2-mile hike to the campsite. The trail wound through dense woods, the air fresh but tinged with an earthy, damp smell. As they walked, Emily noticed the absence of birdsong. The only sounds were their footsteps crunching on leaves and the occasional rustle of the wind. "It's so quiet," Emily said, breaking the silence. "Peaceful," David replied, smiling. "Exactly what we need." By evening, they had set up camp near a small clearing by the river. A fire crackled in the middle, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. They laughed, shared stories, and roasted marshmallows. As the night deepened, the stars above sparkled like diamonds, free from the city's light pollution. It wasn't until the fire had died down and they were preparing to sleep that Rachel noticed it. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice low. "Hear what?" Mark replied. Everyone fell silent, listening. At first, there was nothing. Then faintly came a sound. It was distant, almost imperceptible, like whispers carried on the wind. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Probably just the wind through the trees," David said, though his tone lacked conviction. Emily shivered. "Let's just get some sleep." The next morning, the forest seemed less inviting. Shadows lingered longer than they should, and the air carried a strange heaviness. Still, the group pressed on with their plans, spending the day hiking and exploring. By afternoon, they stumbled upon an old, moss-covered stone structure deep in the woods. It looked like the remnants of a small cabin, long abandoned. "This is so creepy," Rachel said, snapping a photo with her phone. David approached the structure, peering inside. The interior was empty save for a broken chair and a pile of debris. As he stepped back, he noticed strange markings etched into the stones. They were crude, almost like runes. "What do you think these mean?" he asked. Mark shrugged. "Probably just some bored kids messing around." But Emily felt a deep unease. "Let's go. I don't like this place." Reluctantly, the others agreed, and they made their way back to the campsite. That night, the whispers returned. Louder this time, Emily woke with a start, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to be coming from all around them, though she couldn't make out the words. She unzipped her tent and peeked outside. The fire had burned out, leaving the clearing in near total darkness. The trees swayed gently, though there was no wind. "David," she whispered. David emerged from his tent, rubbing his eyes. "You hear it too?" Rachel and Mark joined them moments later, both looking equally disturbed. "What the hell is that?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. No one had an answer. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Then abruptly they stopped. The silence was deafening, and for a moment, the group thought it was over. But then, from the edge of the clearing, came a low, guttural growl. "What was that?" Rachel gasped, clutching Mark's arm. David grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the sound. The beam illuminated nothing but trees and shadows. "Stay together," he said firmly. "Let's check it out." "Are you insane?" Emily hissed. "We need to leave." But David was already moving toward the sound, flashlight in hand. The others reluctantly followed, their footsteps hesitant. As they reached the tree line, the growl came again, louder and closer. The flashlight flickered, then went out, plunging them into darkness. Panic set in as the group stumbled back toward the campsite. The whispers returned, now mixed with faint laughter. Emily tripped and fell, scraping her knee. David helped her up, but his face was pale, his bravado gone. "We're leaving," he said. "Now!" They hastily packed their gear, not bothering to organize. As they started down the trail, the laughter grew louder, echoing unnaturally through the forest. Shadows seemed to move just out of sight, and the trees felt closer, as if the forest itself were closing in. "It's just in our heads," Mark said, though his voice trembled. "It's not real." But Emily knew it was real. She could feel it, a presence watching, following. When they finally reached the SUV, they threw their gear inside and piled in. David started the engine, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the forest behind. The group didn't speak until they were miles away, the tension in the car thick. Rachel broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. They didn't have answers. When they reached a small diner on the outskirts of a nearby town, they decided to stop and regroup. Inside, the warm light and chatter of other patrons felt surreal after the terror of the forest. As they sipped their coffee, an old man at the counter overheard their conversation. He turned to them, his weathered face grave. "You were in Black Hollow Forest?" he asked. David nodded. "Yeah, why?" The man's expression darkened. "Locals don't go there. Not anymore. They say it's cursed. Something happened there years ago, something bad." "Like what?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. The man hesitated, then said, "A family disappeared. They were camping, just like you. Search parties found their campsite, but no bodies. Just whispers in the trees. Some say the forest took them." The group left the diner in silence, the old man's words haunting them. None of them ever spoke of the trip again, but the forest left its mark. Rachel had nightmares for weeks, and Mark refused to go camping ever again. Emily would sometimes hear whispers in the wind, even in the safety of her apartment. As for David, he became obsessed. He researched the history of Black Hollow Forest, looking for answers. But the more he learned, the more the whispers returned, until one day, he simply vanished. The police found his car parked at the trailhead, the doors unlocked. Inside was a single note written in his handwriting. "I'm going back. They're calling me... asterisk asterisk." The haunting of Briarcliff Hospital. Nestled on the outskirts of a forgotten New England town, Briarcliff Hospital had been abandoned for decades. Once a bustling medical center, it was now a crumbling relic of the past, its corridors filled with shadows and secrets. Local legends spoke of strange occurrences and whispered of spirits that never left. But for Alex, Maria, and Jake, it was the perfect place for an urban exploration video, the kind that could go viral on their fledgling YouTube channel, Dark Lens Adventures. "We gotta check it out," Alex said, his eyes gleaming with excitement as he showed Maria and Jake the photos he'd found online. "Look at this place. It's creepy as hell." Maria hesitated. "You've read the stories, right? People who go in there, they don't come back the same." "Come on, Maria," Jake said, slinging an arm around her. "It's just a building. Ghosts aren't real." Maria sighed. She'd been outvoted. "Fine, but if something happens, I'm blaming you too." The trio arrived at Briarcliff just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hospital in hues of orange and purple. Its shattered windows and graffiti-covered walls gave it an ominous presence. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a vague map Alex had found online, they slipped through a gap in the rusted chain-link fence. Inside, the air was heavy with decay. The smell of mildew and rot filled their nostrils as their footsteps echoed against the cracked tiles. The hospital's layout was a maze of long hallways and darkened rooms, many still littered with rusted gurneys and forgotten medical equipment. "Let's start with the surgery wing," Alex suggested, consulting the map. "That's where most of the sightings have been reported." "Because that's not ominous at all," Maria muttered, but she followed. As they moved deeper into the hospital, the atmosphere grew colder. Their flashlights revealed peeling wallpaper and faded bloodstains on the floor. Jake pointed his camera at a nearby doorway and whispered, "Imagine the views we'll get from this footage." "If we make it out," Maria muttered under her breath. In the surgery wing, they found an old operating table, its surface rusted and pitted. A set of surgical tools lay scattered nearby, their edges dulled by time. Alex set up his camera on a tripod, aiming to capture the entire room. Okay, let's do an EVP session, he said, pulling out a digital recorder. If there are any spirits here, make your presence known. Say something. Move something. The room was silent except for the hum of their equipment. Then, faintly, there was a sound, a soft, echoing tap. Did you hear that? Maria asked, her voice trembling. Probably just the building settling, Jake said, though he looked uneasy. Alex replayed the recording. The tapping was there, clear and deliberate. And underneath it, a faint voice whispered, "Leave." They pressed on, their nerves fraying with each step. The next stop was the pediatric ward. The sight of tiny beds and faded murals of cartoon characters added a layer of sadness to the eerie atmosphere. Maria paused by a small, rusted tricycle lying on its side. "This place is wrong," she said. "We should leave." "We've only just started," Alex said. "We can't leave now." Suddenly, Jake's flashlight flickered and went out. "Damn thing," he muttered, smacking it against his hand. The moment his light died, the temperature plummeted. Maria's breath came out in visible puffs, and a low, guttural groan echoed down the hallway. It wasn't human. "What the hell was that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaking. "Run," Maria said, grabbing his arm. "Now!" But before they could move, the tricycle, motionless for decades, squeaked as its wheels slowly began to turn. Panic set in as the group sprinted down the hallway, their flashlights bobbing wildly. They turned corner after corner, but the hospital seemed to shift around them, its layout twisting and warping. Doors that had been open were now locked, and hallways stretched impossibly long. "This can't be real," Alex shouted, his voice echoing. They stumbled into what appeared to be the morgue. Stainless steel drawers lined the walls, their labels faded and unreadable. In the center of the room stood an autopsy table, its surface gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. Maria's voice was barely a whisper. "Why do we come here?" Before anyone could answer, a loud bang reverberated through the room. One of the drawers had slid open on its own. Inside was a body bag, its zipper slowly pulling down to reveal nothing. The bag was empty. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Now!" As they retraced their steps, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. Words like "stay" and "forever" were clear among the chaos. Maria suddenly screamed, pointing ahead. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, shrouded in shadow. Its head tilted unnaturally as it began to move toward them, its steps slow but deliberate. "Run!" Alex shouted. They turned and bolted, the figure's footsteps echoing behind them. It moved faster than seemed possible, closing the distance no matter how quickly they ran. Jake tripped and fell, his camera skidding across the floor. The figure loomed over him, its face wrong. Its features were blurred, as if they were shifting constantly. "Help me!" Jake screamed. Alex and Maria pulled him up, and the three burst through a set of double doors. They found themselves back in the main lobby, the exit just ahead. Without looking back, they sprinted toward the shattered glass doors and into the night. Outside, they collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. The hospital loomed behind them, silent and dark. But as they watched, the faint outline of a figure appeared in one of the windows, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "We're never doing this again," Maria said, her voice shaking. "Agreed," Alex replied, clutching his camera tightly. But when they reviewed the footage the next day, they found something they couldn't explain. The video showed them entering the hospital, exploring its eerie halls. But in the final minutes, the camera captured something none of them remembered. A hand, pale and skeletal, reaching for Alex's shoulder just before the screen went black.